The bell does not simply call, it lingers, draping its iron voice over the village like a shroud. Each toll vibrates through the mist, settling into the frost slick that coats the thatch. The stones, the very breath of those awake to hear it. Somewhere beyond the narrow lanes, a hound gives a muted howl, then falls silent, as though shamed for breaking the solemn air. Inside the hall, the young woman remains motionless, save for the tremor in her clasped hands. Her knees ache from the cold of the rush-covered floor, yet she does not shift her weight. To move too soon, to appear restless in the eyes of the elders, would be to invite whispers, and whispers cling longer than frost in winter. The midwife's hens, still warm when they were carried in, now lie slack at her feet, their blood darkening the pale straw. The coppery scent seeps upward, mixing with the smoke from the damp logs. It is a smell that clings to the hair, to the linen, to the soul. The women in the corner chant again, their voices threading through the air like smoke through rafters. No single word stands apart. They are fragments, worn smooth by centuries of repetition. The bride does not fully understand them. She suspects many do not, but the meaning is not in the words, it is in the weight they carry, the way they bend the room toward, the altar of tradition. The woman with the hemp cord steps forward. Her fingers, cracked and ridged with age, brush the bride's skin as she winds the fibers around her wrists. The cord smells faintly of rain and storage chests. Salt and ash follow the sting of grit pressed against her veins, the taste of it rising in the back of her throat as if her body already knows to swallow obedience. She remembers her mother telling her once, in a voice too tired to be tender, that a marriage begins not with love, but with binding. She had not understood, until now, that binding was not only of flesh to flesh, but of self to silence. Outside, the frost bites the groom's bare feet. He does not flinch. The elders on either side stand as still as carved saints, their breath like the smoke of extinguished candles. In his hand, the bundle of rue and rosemary trembles faintly in the wind. He watches the door of the hall as if it were the gate to both his fortune and his sentence. The girl's father remains unmoving, one hand curled around the rusted key. His gaze rests not on his daughter, but on the floor between them, the invisible threshold where she ceases to belong to his house. The key is not to her chamber, nor to a coffer, but to the great chest that holds the written bonds of land and blood. When the ritual is done, that key will be turned in a lock for the last time, sealing the record of her name in one ledger, and opening it in another. The hens' bodies are taken away, their blood pooling dark in the rushes until it soaks through. The cord is cut from her wrists and thrown into the fire. The hemp catches with a sudden hiss, curling black before the flames swallow it. Ash is scraped into a small clay pot, stirred into honey until it darkens, then smeared across her lips, by a hand that smells faintly of tallow and herbs. The honey is cloying, almost choking. She forces herself to swallow. The hum from the women shifts now, lower, steadier. Not a lullaby, not quite a dirge. It is the sound one makes to keep a fragile thing from shattering before it reaches its destination. The midwife nods, and the door is opened. The cold enters like a presence, seeping into the space, coiling around ankles and wrists. Beyond the threshold, the archview waits, its needles glistening with frost, its shape like the ribcage of some patient beast. The groom steps forward, his eyes not on her face, but on her feet, where the bundle of herbs is laid. She steps over it without pause, the motion careful but unbroken. The elders shift minutely, relief almost imperceptible in the turn of their shoulders. The bell speaks again, slower now, each toll stretching into the next, like the measured beat of a heart grown weary. The sound rolls down the slope of the hill, into the valley, through the frozen reeds along the mill stream. Somewhere in the distance, it is caught by the trees and returned as a faint, fractured echo. They face each other for the first time as betrothed. He does not smile. She does not speak. The air between them is neither warm nor cold. But wait, centuries of custom pressing in, shaping their silence into something binding. Her father closes the door behind her. The sound is soft, but in her bones, it feels like the turning of a great lock. Above, the black-feathered bird that had nested in the rafters stirs. Its wings catch a sliver of pale light as it slips through a gap in the thatch. It rises into the white sky without looking back, its cry swallowed by the wind. It will not return. They walk together toward the edge of the courtyard, their steps marking the frost. Behind them, the women's song fades, replaced by the low murmur of the elders. The rustle of yew branches, the faint, steady burn of the hearth within the hall. Ahead lies the road to his house. Behind, the door is shut. The bell tolls one last time, the sound lingering in the air like breath in winter, slow to fade, impossible to hold. And somewhere in that sound, though neither will name it, is the first toll of a life that is not entirely theirs. The mist closes in as they walk, swallowing the hall, the arch, the waiting faces. What remains is only the sound of boots on frozen earth, the faint crack of ice beneath the frost, and the knowledge that somewhere, beyond the next turning in the road, the feast awaits, and after it, the bed. The rest will come in time, yet. For now, the wind carries them onward, as if even the air itself has been bound to see this joining through. The hall was quieter than a graveyard at midnight. Only the sound of a ladle scraping the blackened bottom of an iron pot marked the passage of time. The broth within was thin as winter sunlight, thickened only by a fistful of barley and the faintest whisper of sage. It hissed softly where it touched the hotter iron, sending up a damp steam that curled and vanished into the rafters, where cobwebs clung like forgotten prayers. The bride sat low upon a stool, her bare feet hidden beneath folds of coarse linen. Her hair, dark as chestnut bark after rain, hung unbound and heavy, spilling forward as her mother's fingers worked. Through it, the braids she wove were fine as threads of spun gold, each one drawn tight, meant to vanish beneath the wimple that would cover her head before nightfall. Once bound, her hair would never fall loose, again ever be tossed by the wind in play, never be brushed beneath the stars in idle talk. That freedom would die here, in this room, with the comb that lay beside them, silver, dulled with age, its teeth worn smooth by 6 women before her. It had passed through generations like a river, stone-shaped, softened, but never broken. Today, it would leave her hands forever. From outside came the first sign that the hour had turned. The rattle of hooves on frozen earth, the faint jangle of harness buckles, the low, muffled voices of men who carried the air of winter in with them. The groom's kin had arrived, their cloaks lined with wolf fur, their boots crusted white with frost. The glint of dull spurs caught the weak sun as they dismounted, shaking the cold from their gloves. They came not for her, but for the transaction she represented. In their hands, they bore a wooden chest bound with iron, bolts of wool dyed in muted colors, a pewter basin for washing, a small loaf of bread pressed with caraway seeds. These were not gifts to the bride, they were payment to her father for the breaking of his household. The bread would be broken later at the joining feast, but before that, an older ritual demanded its due. A single shoe was brought forth, leather, cracked and softened with wear, its heel smooth from long use. It was placed before the father, who lifted it with the care of one holding a blade. He touched it first to her forehead, then to her heart. No words were spoken, none were needed. The meaning was older than scripture, older than the chapel's own stones. She is no longer of my house, the gesture said. The road she walks is his now. When the shoe was placed into the groom's hand, it was not leather that changed ownership, but the life bound to it. In the corner, a small fire burned low, its embers deep and red. The mother bent over it, dropping sprigs of juniper into the coals. The sharp, resinous smoke rose like a living thing, curling, searching, as if looking for a soul to cling to. It was meant to ward off sickness, misfortune, and the malice of spirits. The bride would soon walk through that smoke, eyes closed, letting it curl about her face, breathing in its bitter sweetness. When she emerged, she would keep silent until the groom's hand touched her shoulder. For once she spoke to him, their lives would be fastened more tightly than rope, more firmly than any oath sworn before men. The joining would not take place. Within the chapel walls, the priest had spoken. This was not the binding of two souls under God, but a blessing given in the sight of the village. And so they gathered at the churchyard gate, where the dead slept beyond in rows beneath the snow. Men stamped their boots against the cold. Women pulled cloaks tighter, cheeks raw from wind. The frost lay thick on the ground, holding the hard prints of their steps like a record of witness. From the bell tower above came the slow peal of iron, and somewhere in the hills, the sound was caught and thrown back, as though the land itself had been summoned to attend. The groom stepped forward, his breath a pale cloud before him. In his hand, he held a coin silver stamped with the king's crest. It was cold when it touched her palm. Her fingers curled around it slowly, as though closing upon a stone drawn from deep water. She would sew it into the hem of her gown to guard against poverty's touch. The weight of it felt heavier than its metal should allow, as if she already knew it would one day be the last coin between her and hunger. They turned together toward the open gate. The hinges moaned as they moved, a sound like old bones shifting after a long rest. Beyond lay the road to his haulstone and dirt, frost and shadow. Somewhere far down that road, there would be a feast and a bed. But here, in this moment, she did not look back at her mother or the fire still burning in the corner of the hall. She walked forward, the smell of juniper in her hair, the coin in her hand, the shoe long gone. The road stretched ahead, indifferent and endless, and as the wind rose, carrying the smoke toward the bare trees, it felt as though the past was being scattered with it, a life carried away into the cold, leaving only the long silence of what must come next. Snow falls in a slow, deliberate drift over the manor courtyard, each flake settling on the worn stones like a quiet verdict passed by an unseen hand. The cold is not sudden, but ancient, the kind that seeps into the bones, the kind that remembers. Winters long before any of the faces here were born. Somewhere beyond the walls, a raven calls once and falls silent in the stables. A groom brushes down the horse that will carry the bride away from the only hearth she has ever known. Its flank glistens faintly under the dim light that filters through the wooden slats, each stroke of the brush releasing the smell of hay, warm fur, and damp leather. The air is sharp with the scent of pine from the wreaths strung along the beams, their green needles dusted with frost. The horse shifts, its hooves muffled by straw, and exhales in heavy clouds that fade into the air, like promises already dissolving. She stands nearby, wrapped in a woolen cloak that is not hers. The groom's family scented a head, lined with rabbit fur, dyed the deep green of their crest. It clings to her shoulders in a way that feels unfamiliar, as though she is wearing someone else's name. Beneath its warmth, her skin feels cold. Her own garments, sewn by her mother's hands, lie folded in a chest she will not open again. From across the courtyard, a woman approaches. Bent by the weight of years, her back curved like a bow, she carries a bundle of twigs tied with black thread. The ends are charred from an earlier fire, a faint curl of ash still clinging to them. She says nothing. She does not need to, stepping. Slowly, she circles the bride 3 times, dragging the bundle lightly along the frozen ground. The faint scratching leaves arcs in the frost, fragile white wounds that will heal with the next breath of wind. This is the sweeping away, an old rite whispered to banish wandering spirits from following a bride to her new home. The bride watches the lines form and vanish beneath the old woman's hand, thinking how easily a path can be erased. The door to the hall groans open. Her father emerges, a flagon in his fist, steam curling from its mouth. His cheeks are flushed from the warmth of the fire inside, his eyes damp from something colder. He pours into a wooden cup, ale brewed from last autumn's barley, thick and faintly sweet, with a shadow of smoke in its taste. He offers it without ceremony. She drinks, not for thirst, but because it is expected. The last sip beneath this roof must be his. The first beyond it will be from another's hand. At the courtyard gate, the groom appears. 2 brothers flank him, their cloaks thrown back despite the winter, the gleam of daggers flashing at their belts. His boots are dark with melted snow, his breath steady. Their eyes meet for a heartbeat, neither warm nor cold, just an acknowledgement that this moment will not be undone. Then he turns to her father. They speak in the clipped tone of transaction, words like coin dropped into a coffer, each weighed and counted. When the speaking ends, there is one final act, the binding of the hands. A strip of linen, woven at her mother's loom, rests in her father's palm. It is the color of unbleached wool, the faint irregularities of the weave telling of nights spent at the spinning wheel. They stand before one another, the linen wound around their wrists, once for winter, once for spring, once for summer, once for autumn. Each turn tightens the knot of what is being made or unmade. A boy, no more than 12, scatters oats. At their feet, the grains vanish into the snow before the birds come. When they do, it is sudden wings beating in a flurry of hunger, beaks striking the ground with quick, violent taps. Their cries cut through the air, sharp against the stillness, before fading again. The linen knot rests between them, pale against their skin. It will remain until the groom cuts it away in his hall, the pieces tucked into a chest as a talisman against barrenness. A gate creaks. They step forward, the procession small against the expanse of the road. Behind them, the frost begins to reclaim the arcs left by the broom, erasing the ritual's marks as if they had never been. The wind rises, carrying the mingled scents of pine and wood smoke out into the fields. Snow falls without haste, settling over ruts and hoofprints, over lines drawn and undone. Somewhere ahead lies the groom's hall, its stone walls colder than the sky, its fire waiting to taste her first breath there. Somewhere behind, door to her father's house closes, the sound small, almost lost beneath the wind. And though the road is narrow and her steps careful, the snow will take them all in time. It always does. The candles flicker like small, restless hearts, their shadows climbing the chapel's ancient stone as if trying to escape. The air is still, save for the faint hiss of burning wick and the priest's low Latin and unbroken river of syllables. Winding through the cold, the bride kneels so still she might be carved of marble, her veil trailing over the worn flagstones, each fold catching the candlelight. The linen is fine spun, but it hides a face not given over to joy, only to quiet endurance. Beside her, the small basket stirs. The white dove within shifts its weight, feathers rustling like whispers in the dark. Its small body trembles, as if sensing that its part in this day is more than ceremony. The priest's voice stops, leaving a silence heavy enough to press against the ribs. Then comes the scrape of the silver basin lifted from the altar. The water inside was drawn this morning from the church well, deep and cold as a grave. Into it he dips a sprig of rosemary, its scent sharp, almost bitter like a memory of summers gone. Droplets fall onto the bride's veil, then her folded hands, their chill sliding into her skin as if sealing some quiet pact. When the priest passes the dove to the groom, the bird's eyes gleam in the candlelight. The man's hands close around it, not tight, but with the strength of someone who knows that things often fly away when they shouldn't. This is not yet an offering, it is a test, older than parchment vows. If the bird returns, they will call it curse. If it does not, they will call it blessing. But the truth is more complicated. Curses and blessings wear the same face, and only time will unmask them. The great wooden doors open with a groan that seems to wake the waiting village. The winter air rushes in, cutting through the warmth of wax and incense. Outside, a crowd gathers close, their breaths rising as pale ghosts in the air. In their hands they carry charms, rings of iron, holly leaves, scraps of cloths tied in Nazi, brushed lightly against the couple as they pass, part blessing, part superstition, the way most things are in such places. The bride lifts her head. Her veil is brushed back for the first time, and the light catches on eyes that shine not from joy but from the weight of the unknown. The gown upon her is heavy, every inch hand-stitched by her kin, patterned with vines and blossoms meant to coax life from barren soil. Her fingers tighten around the groom's as he steps into the thin, pale sunlight and opens his hands to the sky. The dove bursts upward, the beat of its wings sharp against the stillness, scattering the air as though tearing through a veil of its own. It rises into the low clouds, disappearing as quickly as a thought unspoken. All eyes tilt upward, waiting. The murmurs ripple like wind over dry grass. The bird does not return. The crowd exhales, some relieved, some merely thoughtful. The bride steps forward, her skin cold against the man's palm. The church bell tolls once, a deep sound that rolls out over the bare fields and dies among the trees. They walk together toward the village gate, where the frost-crusted earth gives way to the long road. Behind them, the chapel looms in the grey light, its doors closing with a sound like finality. The fields stand frozen on either side, stubble of last year's harvest breaking through the snow like old bones. Somewhere far off, a dog barks once, and the sound is taken by the wind. She listens to it until it is gone. The bird has vanished into the clouds, but in her chest, her heart still beats like wings caught between flight and cage. And as the road narrows into the shadows of distant hills, the scent of rosemary lingers faintly on her skin-sharp, clean, and just bitter enough to remind her that blessings, too, can wound. The fog hangs like an old wool cloak over the world, its threads thick with damp, its edges drawn close to choke the light. Every sound is muffled, every movement softened until it feels as though the air itself is holding its breath. The wooden torches set along the manor walls sputter in the moisture, their flames bowing low as if in quiet submission to the morning. Smoke coils upward and is swallowed whole by the grey sky, leaving no trace. In the center of the courtyard, she stands, barefoot on a mat woven from reeds, each stalk stiff, cold, and biting at the pale skin of her feet. Her breath comes slow, deliberate, leaving small bursts of warmth in the air before they dissolve. Around her move 3 women, old enough that the lines in their faces seem carved by the same hand that once carved the stones of the manor. They are dressed in heavy wool, dyed the brown of earth after rain, and each carries a clay bowl as though cradling the bones of the dead. The first stops before her, tips the bowl, and pours a cascade of grain into her cupped hands. The kernels are hard, dry, and unyielding, their scent faintly sweet with the memory of last year's fields. The woman's lips move in a language almost lost, the dialect of her grandmother's time, heavy with syllables that sound like the turning of soil. Not a single seed may fall. To spill even one is to open the marriage to hunger, to let famine slip in unseen, and live there until the end. She grips the grain as if it is not grain at all, but her breath, her future, her last defense against the barren years. The second woman steps forward, her bowl filled with warm milk that breathes its own ghost into the air. She pours it into a horn cup, carved and polished by a man long dead, and presses it into the bride's hands. The liquid touches her lips, and she tastes the pasture where the cow grazed, the clover crushed under its hooves, the musk of the animal's skin. It is not sweetness, but a living memory poured into her mouth, the quiet life she might have had if the world were kinder. She swallows, slow and careful, knowing this is not a gift, but a measure. The third woman comes last. She dips her fingers into the salt and places a single pinch on the bride's tongue. The crystals bite her mouth, sharp and clean, and for a moment the milk's heaviness is gone. Salt, the price of life in the deep winters, the keeper of meat, the slow preserver of things the earth would otherwise take back. Its taste lingers like a truth she cannot unlayer. Above them, the sound of wings rustles the stillness. Crows gather along the roof beams, their heads jerking as they watch the ritual below. They shift and mutter in low, throaty voices, their black eyes reflecting the flames of the failing torches. None of the women speak of it, but their glances rise briefly. Counting an even number is a blessing. An odd is a curse. The bride does not look. She knows. The women are counting. She knows she would not wish to hear the answer. From within the hall comes the heavy tread of boots, slow and deliberate. The groom steps out of the fog, a figure half-formed until he is almost upon them. In his hands he carries a length of wool dyed the deep, wet red of spilled wine. Without a word, he wraps it around her waist, once the wool whispering against the fabric of her dress. He ties the knot over her stomach, the wool pulling tight, a promise for children, a claim for his house, and a silent reminder that the knot will remain until it is cut with iron on the first night. A man from his family emerges from the mist, a chest balanced on his shoulder. The wood is dark with oil, the metal fittings dulled with age. When it is set down between the families, the sound is hollow, as if the chest itself holds a silence older than either house. Inside lie folded linen, dull pewter, salted meat. Her father rests his palm upon it, his fingers splayed wide, and leaves it there longer than the moment requires. Then he steps back. His face holds nothing, not grief, not pride, just the blank patience of a man watching the tide take what he could never anchor. The grain she has held through the rite is gathered back into the bowls, but it is not kept. As they walk toward the gate, the women scatter it onto the frost-hardened path. The birds descend in a frenzy, their wings beating the air into a storm of white and black, their cries tearing the morning's quiet to ribbons. Still, the crows remain unmoving on the beams, their shapes cut sharp against the pale fog. The gate opens with a groan. The fog seems to lean forward to swallow them as they step beyond the wall. The bride walks at the groom's side, the red wool tight at her waist, the salt still sharp on her tongue. The mat behind her lies empty, its reeds bent and broken under the memory of her weight. The air still smells faintly of grain. The torches burn low, their last flames dying under the damp. And as the grey closes around them, the crows do not move. Not until the couple is gone from sight. Not until the fog itself begins to thin. Only then does one black wing open. Only then does the first slow, heavy beat carry a shadow into the cold sky, flying in the same direction they have gone. The hearth's breath is tired, its glow pulsing faintly like the last heartbeat of a dying ember. The longhouse smells of wool and wood smoke, of the damp earth beneath the floorboards, and the faint sweetness of lavender drifting from the bowl on the table. Shadows cling to the rafters like old secrets, shifting only when the fire spits a stray spark. The air is still, except for the slow rhythm of the comb in the bride's hair. Her mother's hands are steady, but the strokes are not without weight. Each pass of the bone comb feels like the drawing of a line that will never be crossed again. The comb's teeth catch now and then in a knot, and her mother pauses, untangling with careful fingers. She says nothing, there is no need. The silence itself is heavy with understanding. The white linen rests in the bride's lap, a narrow strip no longer than her forearm embroidered in red. Two circles, bound together so tightly their lines are almost one. The pattern is older than the priest's Latin words, older than the stone chapel on the hill. It comes from the time before books and bells, when love and duty were still tangled like roots beneath the soil, and marriage was less a choice than an inheritance. The bride stares at the cloth, her thumb tracing the rough texture of the stitches. Her hands are warm from the fire, but the skin beneath her nails feels cold. She wonders if her grandmother once held such a cloth, if her mother had done the same. She does not ask. She does not dare break the silence. Her mother finishes the combing and sets the comb aside. She reaches for the linen, turns it once in her hands as though reading it like a map, then presses it back into the bride's palms. "Hold it until he takes it," she murmurs, her voice barely above the crackle of the hearth. The bride nods. The wooden door groans as it opens, and the winter rushes in, curling around their legs like a pale animal. It smells of wood from the village fires and the sharp bite of snow on the air. Somewhere outside, a goat bleats once, high and impatient. Beyond the threshold, the courtyard waits. A small crowd has gathered, stamping their feet to keep warm. Old women pull, their cloaks tighter, breath misting into the cold. A boy no older than 12 holds a rope tied around the neck of a young goat, its dark eyes reflecting the pale light. Its sides steam faintly, its breath drifting in little clouds. This goat will walk with them to the groom's home. Its milk is promised to the first child, if the Lord blesses them with one. The bride steps into the cold, linen still in her grip. She does not look at the faces in the crowd. She can feel their eyes on her, weighing her, counting her steps, as though they were beads on a rosary. The goat shuffles, its hooves clicking on the frozen earth. The groom appears from the far side of the yard. His shoulders are broad beneath his wool cloak, his hands bare despite the cold. He does not smile, but there is a kind of steadiness in the way he walks, toward her, each step measured, deliberate. When he reaches her, he takes her hand without a word. His palm is rough and warm, a worker's hand, a man who has known the weight of tools and the ache of winter labor. At the edge of the courtyard, they pause. The bride's mother steps forward with a small basin of water, steam curling from its surface. Lavender floats within it, pale purple against the wood. The bride kneels, cupping her hands in the water, feeling the brief sting of warmth before it seeps into her skin. She washes slowly, as though erasing the last traces of the girl she was at dawn. When she dries her hands on the linen, the red thread feels almost alive beneath her fingertips. She passes it to the groom. Without looking down, he tucks it into his belt. That small motion seals more than any priest's blessing. It marks her as his, her life now folded into his household. Her name to be spoken at his table, her labor to be given to his fields. They leave through the north gate, the one used for harvest processions in warmer days. But there is no grain, no song, no garlands of flowers. Only the crunch of frost beneath their boots, the hollow sound of hooves following behind, and the grey weight of the sky pressing down. The goat walks at their side, the rope slack between, the boy's small hands and the groom's long stride. The wind slips between their cloaks, carrying with it the faint scent of the hearth they have left behind. It smells of safety, of warmth, of everything that now belongs to the past. The smoke from that hearth rises into the cold air, thin and wandering, until the wind catches it and tears it apart. Somewhere behind them, in the longhouse they will not return to, the fire still burns, but the lavender is fading, carried away in wisps, vanishing before the first mile is behind them. The road north curves into the pale horizon, and the fog begins to roll in from the low fields, swallowing the shape of the village. Soon there will be nothing behind them but grey asterisk. The fire's glow held steady, as though unwilling to let them go. The embers whispered beneath their thin veil of ash, sending faint shadows climbing the woven hunts and battles stitched on the longhouse walls. In the dim light, the bride's hair gleamed where the comb had passed, each strand catching the flicker like threads of dark gold. Her mother's hand lingered at the crown of her head a moment longer than needed, pressing just enough to remind her she was still here, still rooted, before the cold would pull her into another life. The linen strip lay obedient across her knees. She had traced those red stitches until the lines blurred in her vision, until the circles seemed to turn upon themselves, swallowing beginning and end alike. They had been stitched by her mother's hands in the deep months of last winter, when the snow stood higher than the window's ledge, and the air inside smelled only of tallow smoke and boiled grain. The thread itself had been dyed from madder roots pulled from the fields, their bitter scent lingering as they boiled in the pot, a scent she had always disliked, though now she could not help but breathe deeply of it, as if to take something of this place into her bones. Her mother placed the comb down beside the lavender water, the handle gleaming pale as bone in the firelight. She leaned forward, fingers brushing the linen as though testing the tightness of its weave. Then, wordlessly, She turned it and set it back in her daughter's hands. No blessing, no final advice. There was nothing to say that would not loosen the knots they both needed to keep tight. Outside, the courtyard's murmur rose and fell with the wind. Boots shuffled on hard ground, and the clink of a goat's tether rang out, sharp and hollow in the air. Somewhere beyond the gate, a crow called Once Long Horse, like a question left unanswered. The door opened under her mother's pull, and the cold swept in at once, a long inhalation of the world beyond the walls. It bit at her skin, found its way beneath the wool over her shoulders, and coaxed the last warmth from her breath. The crowd parted when she stepped outside. They did not cheer. This was not a feast day, not a summer joining with garlands and song. It was a winter wedding, bound not by joy alone but by necessity, before the snow closed the roads entirely, before the hunger of the lean months set teeth to bone. Women in rough-dyed cloaks watched from beneath their hoods, their eyes steady and without smile. The men's hands rested on the heads of children too young to understand the weight of what they were seeing. The goat stood with its head lowered, chewing at nothing. Steam curled from its nostrils, rising into the grey air. It shifted when she came near, the rope twitching in the boy's small hands. Its milk would be the first nourishment for the child they all assumed would come, the unspoken pledge of fruitfulness for this new household. But the goat's gaze was as blank and unreadable as the sky. The groom emerged from the far side, his boots cracking the frost with each step. The leather was worn but clean, his cloak trimmed with the narrow fur of winter hair. He looked at her in the way one looks at the horizon, not to read it, but to acknowledge its presence. When his fingers found hers, they were warm, the skin thickened by work. The strength there was not cruel, but it was not gentle either. It was the grip of someone who had learned to carry weight without asking when it would be set down. They walked together to the basin her mother held ready. Steam rose in soft ribbons from the lavender water, and she lowered her hands into it slowly, letting the warmth ache into her knuckles. Her fingertips traced the surface as though she could stir the scent deeper into the lines of her skin. When she dried her hands on the linen, it felt heavier than before, as if it had drunk something of her in those brief moments. The groom took the cloth without ceremony, folding it once and tucking it into his belt. That simple motion cut through the air like the fall of a seal on parchment. It was done. She was his. They passed beneath the north gate, the one her feet had known since childhood, though never in this direction. The iron hinges groaned behind them, and the sound carried across the yard like the moan of something ancient waking. The road was hard beneath their boots, its frost-slick surface glittering faintly in the weak light. The goat followed, tethered, between boy and man, hooves striking sharp against the frozen earth. Houses leaned against the wind, their thatch dusted with frost, smoke trailing thin and slow from their chimneys. Faces peered from narrow windows, disappearing before her gaze could meet theirs. She could feel the weight of their watching, all the same their eyes tucking away the sight of her leaving, storing it like grain against the famine of long winter days. The fog thickened as they left the village, rising from the low fields in slow, rolling breaths. It swallowed the shapes of fences, softened the black lines of bare trees. Within it, sound carried strangely. The bleat of the goat seemed to come from somewhere far ahead, though it was only a few steps behind. The groom's boots crunched, in time with hers, their breath mingling in faint clouds. Hours passed in the slow rhythm of winter travel. marked only by the dark shapes of crows following from the trees, their wings cutting through the pale air like strokes of ink on wet parchment. The road narrowed as it climbed into low hills, and the wind grew sharper. Her cloak caught at her legs, heavy with frost at the hem. The boy with the goat fell silent, his cheeks reddened from the cold, his hands stiff on the rope by the time. They saw the smoke from the groom's hall. The light had begun to fail. The sky deepened into the color of iron, the first faint stars struggling against the weight of cloud. The hall stood alone on its rise, timber walls braced against the wind, the high roof patched with snow. He led her to the threshold, but did not cross. The goat was led away, the boy disappearing around the far side where the animal pens lay. The heavy door was pulled open, and the heat of the hearth reached for her in a long, slow exhale. She stepped inside, her boots creaking against the boards. The scent of unfamiliar smoke and strangers' voices settling over her like a new cloak she had not yet learned to wear. Behind her, the door closed with the sound of something final. Ahead, the hall waited, its firelight a circle she would now live within, its shadows a map she had yet to learn. Asterisk. The river ran slow, the ice gripping its surface like an old hand unwilling to let go. Only in narrow channels, where the current pressed hardest, did water break free, dark, moving, restless. The sound was muted, a hushed gurgle beneath the brittle silence of winter. Along the bank, the wooden footbridge stretched toward the chapel island, its beams pale with frost, its planks groaning softly as the wind passed over them. Beyond the bridge, half hidden in the skeletal branches of willow and alder, rose the chapel, a low stone structure with a roof of mossdark tiles. Its bell tower, no taller than a watchman's post. It was a place apart, meant for vows that could not be spoken in the muddy square of the village. A place for the blessings that lived closer to God. She stood at the near side of the bridge, the frost crunching faintly beneath her boots. Her cloak was drawn close around her shoulders, the hood casting a deep shadow over her face, hiding everything but the pale edge of her cheek and the faint breath that drifted in front of her lips. In her arms, she carried the loaf, rye bread, still warm, the crust rough and browned, the center seeded with dried berries. The scent was rich, earthy, carrying with it the warmth of the hearth she had left behind. In the old customs, this bread was not only sustenance, it was the road in physical form, a thing that must be given and received before two lives could walk alongside one another. Across the bridge, the groom stood waiting. The frost caught in his hair and beard gave him the look of a man carved from the same winter that surrounded them. At his sides were two elders from his kin, their faces weathered like old leather eyes, watchful. Between them was a tall wooden pole from which hung 3 strips of cloth, one white, one red, one black. They fluttered in the wind, snapping softly, like distant banners in a battlefield no one could yet see. The colors were not for decoration. Each strip was a living symbol, the red for the blood of life, the white for the breath of peace, the black for the trials that even the most faithful love could not avoid. She stepped forward, the first board under her foot, sighing at the weight. The bridge was narrow, only wide enough for one to pass at a time. Beneath her, the river moved in slow, shadowed ripples, the water dark and patient, its cold reaching upward through the wood. She did not rush. Each step sounded louder than it should have in the quiet air, the small creaks answering the murmuring current below. At the center of the bridge, she met him. Neither spoke. The groom reached for the bread, his hands bare despite the cold, his fingers brushing hers. Without ceremony, he broke the loaf in two, steam curling up in the frosted air. He gave her one half and kept the other, their eyes holding for a moment before they each took a bite. The bread was heavy, the taste of rye deep and grounding, the berries adding a small sweetness, as if to remind them that even in the hard seasons, some grace might remain. This was the sharing of the road. Once eaten, their lives were bound to move forward as one, whether along smooth paths or stones sharp enough to draw blood. When the last crumbs were brushed away, the elders stepped forward. They began to knot the strips of cloth together, red into white, white into black, black into red, each knot pulled tight with the strength of age and intention. As their hands moved, their voices rose in the old tongue, the words shaped from the same syllables that had been used by ancestors, long buried. Few in the village understood all the meanings now, but the cadence carried weight, and the air felt heavier with each knot drawn closed. By the time the last was tied, the strips hung together like one long, weather-worn banner, their colors stark against the gray sky. They crossed the remainder of the bridge together. The groom carried the knotted cloth. She walked half a step. Behind, at the far side, the chapel's open doors yawned black in the winter light. From within, a single candle burned on the altar, its flame steady and tall, defying the draught that moved through the stone walls. They knelt, their knees pressing into the cold floor, and the elders hung the cloth along the rail between them. The bell above rang once, a thin, clear note that floated across the frozen river, striking the air with a sound both sharp and fragile, in the old belief that note was the soul's first step into its new life. The moment when two names began to move toward one another in the records of heaven. When they emerged, snow had begun to fall, thin flakes drifting on the wind, settling into their hair, their cloaks. The bridge behind them swayed slightly, the water beneath darker now in the fading light. The bread was gone, the knots were tied, and the air smelled faintly of iron and frost. Whether the road ahead would lead them toward feast or famine, no one could yet say, but the river, slow and patient, would remember this crossing long after the people had gone. Asterisk. Snow had begun to fall in the way it sometimes does before night fully claims the sky, not in flurries, but in quiet, deliberate descent. Each flake seemed to weigh more than it should, spinning once or twice before giving itself to the earth. The wind had no howl in it now, only a kind of breath that could be heard if one stood still long enough. The chapel door had been left open behind them. No one dared close it. Inside, a single candle burned on the altar, flame thin but unbent. Despite the open threshold, its light did not seem to fade with distance. They stepped out into the yard, their hands still bound together with the ritual cloth, a braid of unbleached linen and dark wool, knotted at intervals, each not a small fist between them. The damp cold had stiffened it. The cloth no longer lay softly, but resisted, pulling skin when either moved too quickly. The elders moved ahead in a slow procession, their boots sinking into the snow in lines that vanished almost as soon as they were made. The bride's head was lowered, her breath visible with every exhale. The groom kept his eyes forward, but not on the path they fixed somewhere beyond, perhaps on the shadowed hills or the unseen river. The sound of bells carried faintly, not from any visible source, but from somewhere low, as if buried beneath the snow. They came to a table, no more than a board laid on trestles, its legs frozen into the ground. Upon it lay objects whose arrangement seemed both careful and without explanation. A sprig of rosemary browned with age, a bundle of pine needles bound in twine, and a wooden bowl filled with black water that steamed faintly though the air was below freezing. Beside the bowl lay 3 stones, each wet though no snow had touched them. The bride's mother stepped forward, her face unreadable. She took from her sleeve a length of raw wool, unspun and curling at the ends. She dipped it into the black water, lifted it dripping, and wound it once, twice, thrice around her daughter's bound wrists. The warmth of the water spread quickly, but the smell was metallic, and the bride tasted iron in her mouth, though none had touched her lips. No one spoke until the groom's uncle, a man with a voice like distant gravel, murmured, "Do not look over your left shoulder until you pass the first gate." It was not warning but law, as though the truth of it was older than the path they stood upon. The elders turned and began walking again. The river ran to their right now, its surface a quilt of ice broken only in narrow seams where the current still showed through. The sound of water was faint, less a rush than a slow, dragging pull, as if it moved unwillingly. Now and again there came a sharp report, the sound of ice cracking, but the river's face remained unchanged. The first gate rose from the ground ahead, freestanding, unattached to any fence or wall. Its crossbeam was rough, unplaned timber, from which hung 3 objects: a crow, featherless and black-skinned, its feet bound with twine, a bundle of reeds tied in red cord, and a single unglazed clay bell, which swayed though no wind moved it, as the bride and groom stepped beneath. The bell gave one deep, dull note. The sound seemed to remain long after they had passed, as if carried inside their ears rather than the air. The path narrowed after the gate, snow deepening until it dragged at their steps. On either side rose low mounds crusted with ice, perhaps burial or perhaps nothing at all. The bride stumbled once and nearly fell, but the groom caught her without speaking. The cloth between them pulled tighter, though neither had moved their hands. The second gate was smaller, its frame bowed inward. A woman waited before it, her body wrapped in a thick robe, her head and face hidden behind a veil of coarse horsehair. In her hands, she held a loaf of bread so dark it was almost black, dusted with something pale that was not flour. She tore the loaf in half and gave each their share. The bread was bitter, so bitter it seemed to draw the moisture from their mouths. The groom swallowed his in one bite. The bride let hers soften, but the taste only deepened. The veiled woman stepped backwards into the snow until the falling flakes erased her from sight. The linen strips nailed to the frame of the second gate were blackened at the edges, as if scorched. They lay flat against the wood, unmoving, though. The wind had risen again. From a priver, crack, pause. Crack, no one looked toward it. The third gate stood taller, hung with fish heads dried to bone, their eyes clouded white. Below them sat a shallow dish of salt untouched by snow. The elders formed 2 lines here, creating a passage for the couple. Each elder touched the bride's bound hands with 2 fingers, murmuring words too low to hear. When the last had passed, the groom's gaze flicked toward her for the first time since they had left the chapel, but whatever passed between them was brief and unreadable. The snow grew deeper still as the path climbed toward a low ridge. The smell of smoke began to carry in the air, though no fire was visible. Once, somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp, single, and final. The fourth gate had no crossbeam. Only 2 carved posts stood, each topped with a skull. Not quite human, not quite animal, the bones stretched in strange proportion. The bride slowed, but the groom's pace did not, and the cloth between them pulled taut until she moved again. The elder said nothing as they passed between. The fifth gate lay beyond a clearing where 7 blackened stones stood in a ring. At the center was a pit of ash from which a single thin column of steam rose, bending toward them though the wind blew the other way. An old man waited there, his back bent, his hands strong. He tied another knot into the cloth between them, so tight the fibers strained, and said, "The road is longer now." Past the 5th gate, the sound of the river was gone. In its place came a slow, steady thrum, like breathing beneath the snow. The air thickened. The snow fell heavier, each flake large and deliberate. From behind them, faint and far, the clay bell rang again. They did not turn.